Probably the only thing more ridiculous than this election cycle is making a video about it and expecting your reward for doing so to be something other than getting torched by both sides. But for better or worse, there's one amazingly asinine aspect of it that I just gotta get off my chest.
Women can whine their way into the White House.
Alright, a bit of quick housekeeping before I get started here. There are going to be a lot of articles and sources flying by during this video, so keep in mind that, as always, you can find links to everything down below in the video description. If it's not obvious already, the reason why I included a video about the run for the White House in my Female Privilege series will become clear soon enough. About a year and a half ago, I started to get that sinking feeling in my stomach about the inevitable course that this election would take, and it's only gotten worse since.
Well, what women need to realize is that they are the subject of the worst human rights abuse on earth in many different ways, and I think that the women, if they speak up, those who are in a powerful position or in a position of influence, if they'll take the leadership, that'll be the best way to break down the barrier that now exists in women reaching their justifiable rights.
Now, I suppose you can consider it complete coincidence that an elder Democratic statesman, Democratic with a capital D now, like Carter, would be talking about powerful women attaining positions of leadership in order to break down alleged barriers to their justifiable rights, at the exact time Hillary Clinton's bid for the White House was getting under full swing. But personally, I think it's pretty obvious that the tone the Democratic National Committee wanted to set right from the start was that it's time for a woman to be in the White House, regardless of consequences or whatever qualifications she may or may not have, and all the scandals she may or may not actually be responsible for. Hillary just magically deserves to sit in the Oval Office because vagina. And the DNC email leaks have pretty much put to rest any doubts that this was reality. Bernie Sanders, Hillary's opponent in the primaries, never had a chance, no matter how popular his campaign became. And no matter how many signs from some god of socialism or whatever, that he was the mythical chosen one. And of course, it mattered not one single solitary bit to Hillary that while all this backroom dealing to freeze Bernie out of the race was going on, he unwittingly did her the foolish favor of giving her a pass in the debates on allegations of corruption.
Let me say something that may not be great politics, but I think the Secretary is right. And that is that the American people are sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails.
Thank you. Me too. Me too.
You know?
Nope. She and her campaign and her husband went right ahead and rewarded him and his supporters for such kindness with a political knife in the back in the form of accusations of sexism.
You know?
Bernie fucking left of Jimmy Carter Sanders. Sexist. You can't even make this ridiculous shit up. The only thing Bernie's guilty of when it comes to gender issues is being a shill for feminism. And if that makes you sexist, well, that's news to pretty much everyone on planet Earth, I expect. Bernie trying to placate the insatiable is proof once again that these are the thanks you can expect for bothering to brown-nose the man-hating bigots that populate the feminist movement. I'm not really sure how someone as gracious and gullible as Bernie Sanders made it so far in American politics, especially when his platform lends itself so readily to critics of socialism, of which there is no shortage in the US. But despite the system being rigged for Hillary, in many ways he ultimately has only himself to blame for losing the Democratic nomination. Only a few months before this debate, where he drove his nose as far as he could up Hillary's ass to his own detriment, he was chased off the stage in Seattle for being racist or for his white privilege or whatever the bogus complaint was about him.
We want an opportunity to We want to know
Okay,
who's on the
okay,
mic.
okay. Well, ask him.
Get him in check or we're shutting this event down. Now. If you do not listen to her, your event will be shut down right now.
Okay. All right, so we are trying to be reasonable. We are trying to be reasonable. We are trying to be reasonable.
We are reasonable.
We are trying. We're gonna give you. We're gonna let you on the mic.
Again, Bernie fucking left of Jimmy Carter Sanders. Racist. What the fuck? And could Hillary be bothered to defend the guy? Maybe do him the favor of mentioning his civil rights activism in the 60s? Throw him some kind of bone while the radical left tried to tear him to pieces? Nope, nothing but silence from the Clinton camp, and the DNC for the most part as well. Because when Hillary's not using her woman card to sharpen the knife she's going to drive in her opponent's back, she's more than happy to let him hang. That knife will never be used to cut the rope. Count on it. So after being abandoned and hung out to dry, for some inexplicable reason, Bernie rewards this deceitful, self-interested, power-hungry schemer with a shiny golden get-out-of-corruption jail free card. I mean, what a fucking idiot. You didn't even need WikiLeaks to tell you for whom the DNC was rigging the system. It was fucking obvious that they were going to do everything in their power to hand Hillary the nomination. How could Sanders be that fucking oblivious and stupid? Anyway, despite his own bungling incompetence, and the system rigged against him, Bernie somehow magically managed to still have life at the end of the primaries. So of course he required another stake in his male heart, which dared to keep on beating.
What do you say to women who say that you staying in the race, what do you say to women who say that you staying in the race is sexist because you're standing in the way of what could be the first female president?
Is that a serious question?
Yes, it is.
What a sexist pig, not just rolling over and dying for the poor oppressed vagina-toting Hillary, you know? Now, going into the general election, I kind of assumed that Hillary would lay off the shrill sexism shrieking, at least for a little while, because she would need to move more towards some political center rather than pacify her deluded radical feminist base all the time. And this largely turned out to be the case. I mean, shit, she hardly said anything, let alone accuse Trump or the independent candidates of sexism or racism or whatever. But after a while, when it became obvious Trump would not actually choke on the foot he kept putting in his mouth, and the polls started tightening, Hillary and her supporters knew it was time to take action. The same action they took against Bernie. The only action that gets you attention anymore in the, quote, current year, unquote. Start screaming victimization every 5 fucking seconds. Because Hillary knows real issues that affect real people require you to turn your back on your opponent, figuratively, in order to concentrate your time and energy on said issues. And that opponent could be just like her, wanting to drive a political knife in your back each and every time you drop your guard. So that fast forwards us to the present, and the first debate between Trump and Hillary, and the absolutely fucking ridiculous tweet exchange between the two candidates. One that Hillary instigated and readily and willingly participated in, and then tried to pretend she was above it all like an 11-year-old. And it also brings us to the real point of this video. Alright, so much bullshit has gone down in the past few weeks that it's hard to know where to start, so let's just dive right in with one rather predictable claim on Hillary's supporters' part when it became clear something was definitely up with her health. Ableism. That's right, ableism. So if you're concerned about Hillary's health and whether or not she can tolerate the grueling rigors of being president, which aged the living shit out of anyone assuming that office, you're not only sexist like Bernie, you're not only ageist, but you're also ableist, apparently. And if Hillary were black, I'm sure you'd be racist too. For those who don't keep up with the latest and greatest social justice buzzwords, and I don't blame you, ableism is kind of like sexism or racism against disabled people. And as you can tell by its misuse here in regards to people rightly concerned whether or not Hillary or any other candidate for that matter can withstand the demands of the White House, like sexism and racism, this term is well on its way to being worn out and rendered meaningless. When comics start accurately predicting your vacuous outrage well in advance of when you actually perpetrate it, it's probably time to grow up and stop dreaming up imaginary oppression and catchy terms for it. But I don't suppose there's much motivation to give this particular tactic a rest when, as a female, you yourself will never be found guilty of this imaginary oppression that you can always pin on your opponents. I know I shouldn't be surprised at this point, but it still shocks me when Hillary not only slings around allegations she knows are hypocritical bullshit, but gets away with it. This debate moment here was a jaw-dropper for me, and again, I know I shouldn't have been shocked.
But remember, Donald started his career back in 1973 being sued by the Justice Department for racial discrimination because he would not rent apartments in one of his developments to African Americans, and he made sure that the people who worked for him understood that was the policy.
And I'm not even interested in making the case that what Hillary claims here is false. It's my opinion that Trump absolutely did steer black people away from his apartment buildings over 40 years ago. But when has Hillary ever considered a racist past something that eliminated you from becoming a politician? Especially if associating with you benefits her politically in some way. What, KKK leaders or officers or whatever the hell Bird was can change, but New York landlords can't? Give me a fucking break. If white flight wasn't a reality at the time, I'm sure Trump would have had no problem at all taking in black people as tenants. Provided, of course, there were no KKK officers around threatening to burn his apartment buildings down for doing so. I mean, do you really think someone as devoted to profits as Trump is would really care what race you are if your rent check's on time each month? Given there were no larger extenuating social circumstances beyond his control, unfortunately turning your presence into something that reduced the number of other rent checks he could collect. And again, this doesn't excuse him for what he did, but it also doesn't put him on the same level as a KKK leader either. Earlier in the debate, they were asked about racial division in the U.S., and Hillary brought up systemic racism.
And it's just a fact that if you're a young African American man and you do the same thing as a young white man, you are more likely to be arrested, charged, convicted, and incarcerated.
Again, I'm not going to argue that Clinton is wrong here. I'll leave that to other people. The only thing I want to point out, once again, is that she's anything but interested in telling the full story, especially the part she played in it all. Because as Trump goes on to illustrate by referencing her, quote, super predator, unquote, comments, if we as a society are indeed still dealing with lingering systemic racism, the policies the Clintons pushed in the 90s largely contributed to this state of affairs. And just as an aside, notice that Hillary eagerly points out racial imbalances in our justice system because as a progressive politician who happens to have a vagina, she's allowed to do so ad nauseum without backlash for her own crimes on this account. But there's one legal system bias and sentencing disparity she will never bring up for fear of pissing off the mindless feminist hordes that worship her. But I digress. Delving into that topic requires a separate video treatment unto itself. If we all didn't have to deal with the social repercussions of it, we could sit back and admire the female power and privilege on display here, to not only set the agenda and control the narrative, but never suffer any consequences because of it. Set policy as I say, not as I have done. I mean, Clinton literally has people believing Trump is unfit to be president because he called a beauty pageant contestant who dated a drug kingpin fat. You might think threats to a presidential candidate's life are more pressing than calling someone fat, but you'd be mistaken because you're forgetting that calling someone with a vagina obese, without a doubt, takes priority over death threats. Well, as long as they're not perceived threats against a female candidate. And as Germany buckles under the weight of Merkel's reckless plan for unlimited, unvetted refugee migration, Hillary gleefully praises her for it, and gives every sign that she will be setting a similar refugees welcome agenda for our own country.
Look, I like a lot of the world leaders. One of my favorites is Angela Merkel, because I think she's been an extraordinary, strong leader during difficult times in Europe, which has obvious implications for the rest of the world, and most particularly our country. Her leadership and steadiness on the Euro crisis and her bravery in the face of the refugee crisis is something that I am impressed by. I've known her.
And no one in the mainstream media takes her to task for it. They're too busy skewering Gary Johnson for a much less harmful mistake. But remember, the political system favors men, not women, right? Look, I never bought into the conservative effort to demonize Bill Clinton's overactive libido, the Clintons' marriage, and whatever infidelity was going on inside it, or wasn't going on, is their own personal fucking problem. I just don't care. And I thought it was absurd back in the 90s that conservatives made it into such a big issue for the country and forced Clinton to twist the truth in a kangaroo court, and I still do, if you care to know. But its absurdity is only matched or surpassed by Hillary living in a glass house and hurling misogyny stones every which way at everyone else. It is completely hypocritical to brush off Bill Clinton's behavior, but run around with your hair on fire over Trump's statements about women. Only a feminist like Hillary could be so obviously duplicitous and reap political rewards from acting that way. And now with this latest gaffe, in which audio of Trump has surfaced where he was, wait for it, mean to women again, it seems like even normies are finally catching whiffs of all the gynocentric madness out there. But they don't quite get the enormity of it all, and how deep the roots of the double standard have grown, or at least they're not quite prepared to come to grips with it, because that would cause them to question their own gynocentrism. But look, I could point out hypocritical whining on Hillary and her feminist supporters' part all day. And I get it, Trump's a buffoon, and I'm honestly not expecting much from his presidency. I don't really buy into the notion that he will change an awful lot that's wrong with the system. But he's not the one causing this election cycle to devolve into it's the current year bullshit. And if he is actually elected, he won't be facilitating more anti-male bullshit like yes means yes legislation so it can expand beyond college campuses into the general public. And he won't be enacting legislation that will correct a non-existent wage gap, which will simply mean more taxation for men for being devoted to their careers so that women can be less devoted and get paid the same. And we will not see 500,000 unvetted Muslims flooding into our country. And the reason why I keep stressing unvetted is because you cannot, by definition, vet Syrian refugees. The Syrian regime is not friendly with the U.S., so it does not share intelligence about its citizens or people within its borders with us, so we have no way of knowing what these people were up to, such as assisting ISIS if they were doing that. We can't find this out. Anyway, you can rest assured that shit like all of this will not happen under a Trump presidency, whereas it's pretty much a foregone conclusion with Clinton in the Oval Office. Think back to 2008 and 2012. Did Barack Obama ever insinuate that McCain or Romney were racist, let alone do it a number of times, or make outright accusations of racism against them? Now, obviously, a portion of his supporters were very vocal about the supposed racism of birthers and people who thought Obama was a Muslim. I personally think most of them were guilty, if that's the right word, of nationalism more than they were guilty of racism. But most liberals ignorantly consider that a distinction without a difference at this point. Fact of the matter is, even if you hate Obama, you have to admit that he and his campaign mostly took the high road when it came to the issue of race. Whereas Hillary and the I'm with her crowd will bring up her sex and the alleged sexism of her opponents and how supposedly oppressed she is because she has a vagina any chance they get. And as we've already seen, accusations of sexism are just the tip of the victim routine iceberg with these bleeding bozos. Crybaby nonsense is now a linchpin of the Clinton political machinery and those that slavishly fuel it. Think about it. Were Obama or any of his supporters crying about the opposing side's ageism and ableism or any other ism back in the day? Crying about weakness and expecting it to boost your poll numbers is just not a privilege male candidates have ever had or likely ever will. This is a privilege female politicians guard jealously and will never allow their male counterparts to utilize it and garner positive results from it. Men are the de facto oppressors, remember? So with November 8th rapidly approaching, you gotta ask yourself what a vote for Hillary Clinton means. You probably think I'm telling you not to vote for her, but I'm actually not. I mean, I won't be voting for her if you care to know. All I'm asking you to do is factor into your election day calculus the fact that by voting for Clinton, you are encouraging more it's the current year de minimis bullshit perverting our political process. You are making this act of waving your phony I'm an oppressed woman card around constantly pay off in spades. There's no way around this. If she gets elected, then the style of her campaign will be considered a success and only reproduced to greater degree in upcoming election cycles. If you're not bothered by future presidential candidates arguing over who is less transphobic or who knows what more initials in LGBTQIA whatever stand for, or who can name the most Tumblr genders, then ignore everything I said in this video. If every time a female candidate is challenged or corrected by a male rival, you're perfectly comfortable with hearing that she was just victimized once again by more mansplaining, if you don't mind substantive issues being crowded out of the discourse by meaningless progressive blatherskite, then by all means don't consider any of what I just said when you approach the lever on November 8th. But like it or not, Hillary getting into the Oval Office after running the style of campaign she has chosen to run pretty much guarantees the Tumblrization of the entire process at this point. As the old adage goes, choose wisely.
You know,